For now, it is my great pleasure to introduce a friend and colleague, Professor Oleksandra Wallo, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Slavic Languages and Literatures here at our university. She received her doctorate in Slavic Languages and Literatures from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Her research interests include 20th and 21st century Ukrainian women's writing, gender and nation studies, and post-colonial approaches to the post-Soviet region. She has recently completed a book manuscript about late Soviet and post-Soviet Ukrainian women writers' narratives of the nation, which is based on her dissertation. Her article, The Stone Master, on the invisibility of women's writing from the Soviet-Ukrainian periphery, has come out earlier this year in East-West, Journal of Ukrainian Studies. So with that, please join me in welcoming Oleksandra Wallo.
Thank you very much. Thank you for coming. Thank you for inviting me to give this talk. My talk today will address what some have called a breakthrough for Ukrainian theater, a very recent and significant shift away from the stale, centuries-old dramatic tradition to more innovative and experimental theater that deals with contemporary social and political issues. As Ukrainian playwright and artist Pavlo Arye puts it, quote, Ukraine is witnessing a true overhaul in theater. Ukrainians are only now beginning to understand that theater has to be engaged and open, always searching and probing. In this talk, I would like to explore the role of what is now called the New Drama movement and a few of its proponents in the transformation of contemporary Ukrainian theater. In particular, I will discuss several post-Euromaidan projects by Ukrainian new drama playwright. Her name is Natalia Vorozhbit, who until recently wrote exclusively in Russian. What I think her example and the examples of several of her colleagues demonstrate is that the Euromaidan protests and Russia's ensuing interventions in Ukraine afterwards provided significant impetus for the current ongoing revolution in Ukrainian theater. The new drama movement began in Russia long before it came to Ukraine. In the mid to late 1990s, a number of contemporary plays appeared, written by dramatists who were disenchanted with conventional Russian theater and its emphasis on entertaining the spectator. The movement blossomed with the emergence of several contemporary drama platforms, such as the famous Lyubimovka Festival or Teatr Dok, a Moscow theater founded by Russian playwrights Yelena Gromina and Mikhail Ugarov. Teatr Dok was created specifically to implement and promote the documentary approach to drama, often relying on the so-called verbatim technique. First introduced to Russian dramatists through seminars taught in Moscow in 1999 by British theater makers from the Royal Court Theatre, this method presupposes the creation of a play out of interviews with real people. What unites these people is a common social background or experience. So a verbatim play is usually a montage of unedited, transcribed monologues by these people, which capture their ideas, feelings, as well as all the linguistic features of their speech. This technique turns a play into a powerful study of the social phenomena or issues it addresses and endows it with an aura of authenticity. In performing a verbatim play, actors strive to reproduce as accurately as possible the original linguistic and non-linguistic behavior of the interviewees, instead of interpreting their characters in their own ways. A further modification of documentary theater, called the theater of witnesses, replaces actors with real people who tell their own stories on stage. Not all of new drama uses this verbatim technique, yet the new drama movement was greatly influenced by the philosophy of documentary theater that underlies verbatim. In the words of Ugarov, one of the founders of Teatr Dok, quote, the new dramatists have a pathos that unites them with the avant-garde. They consider that the theater is dead, and that the theater we have, with niceties and metaphors and a backward acting school, is not theater, but a deceit, a great illusion that serves only to send the spectator to sleep for an hour and a half, end quote. By contrast, what scholars Birgit Baumers and Mark Lipovetsky have identified as, quote-unquote, the new neo-naturalist poetics of new drama, privileges authentic speech, which includes jargon, slang, profanities, as well as real-life, socially relevant topics and characters, which will jolt the audience from their slumber and force the audience to think. From the very beginning, the circles of new dramatists in Russia included Ukrainian playwrights Maxim Kurachkin and Natalia Vorozhbet, both of whom wrote in Russian. When they moved to Russia, they made that choice, and even earlier they wrote in Russian. Both moved from Kyiv to Moscow to study at the Maxim Gorky Literary Institute, where they remained after graduation writing plays and screenplays and working closely with Teatr Doc, as well as other new drama platforms. It is largely thanks to their connection to the Russian new drama movement that their plays were staged in Russia and abroad. In particular, Natalia Vorozhbet has collaborated extensively with the British Royal Court Theatre, which commissioned her plays in the 2000s and continues to do so now. As a result, for a long time, both dramatists were much better known in Russia and the West than in Ukraine, paradoxically, and they were frequently referred to as Russian playwrights. Their names were usually transcribed into English from Russian, not Ukrainian. So one would read Maxim Kurachkin with I in Maxim instead of Maxim, and Vorozhbit with I instead of Vorozhbit on the book covers and theater posters. Although Vorozhbit moved back to Kyiv around the time of the Orange Revolution, she maintained close ties with her colleagues in the new drama movement in Russia and continued to write in Russian. In fact, until 2014, both playwrights enjoyed the cosmopolitan Russophone milieu of Moscow's theater world and found their hybrid Ukrainian-Russian identities quite comfortable. However, the Euromaidan protests, Russia's annexation of the Crimea, the war in the Donbass changed all of these things for both of them. Like other Russian-speaking Ukrainians, and perhaps even to a greater extent than many of them, both Kurachkin and Vorozhbet experienced an identity crisis. In their interviews during and after the Euromaidan, they expressed their shock at how quickly supporters of Euromaidan were labeled fascists in Russia. It became important for each dramatist to assert his or her Ukrainian identity in their work. So at this time, both began to insist on the Ukrainian transcription of their names in English. And as Kurachkin's translator and editor of an anthology of new Russian drama, John Friedman, wrote, quote, "During the conflict between Ukraine and Russia in early 2014, Kurachkin proclaimed that from heretofore he should be identified as a Ukrainian playwright," end quote. Vorozhbet stopped making visits to Russia, even though a number of her plays continued to be staged in Russia, especially at the politically independent Teatr Doc. Kurachkin resolved to move back to Kyiv during the Euromaidan events and was eventually able to do so last year. Finally, both dramatists are now striving to speak more Ukrainian in their public appearances and have started writing plays in Ukrainian. Considering their affinities with new drama's political and social orientation, it is no wonder that many of their plays deal with the political events of the last 4 years. Vorozhbet especially has been involved in numerous theater as well as film projects connected to the Euromaidan and the war in the East. A significant number of them are documentary theater projects because, as Vorozhbet has stated in numerous interviews, this form of drama allows one to react quickly to the events unfolding and to capture them without the need for a lengthy period of reflection, which is often deemed necessary for more traditional art forms to address historical events. Thus, even though Vorozhbet has been promoting new drama in Ukraine even before the Euromaidan, for example, she organized a festival called Тиждень актуальної п'єси, a week of contemporary drama, together with director Andriy Mai. The Euromaidan and the ensuing war have really propelled new drama to the forefront of Ukrainian theater. It is a form of theater that holds up a mirror to the recent events, allowing Ukrainians to reflect on their changing identities and to grapple with the shocking realities of war and displacement. So today I will briefly discuss if we have time, four post-Euromaidan theater projects by Vorozhbet. One of them is dealing with Ukrainians' experience on the Maidan, and three address various aspects of the war in the Donbass. Taken together, these projects represent a variety of technical and stylistic approaches within new drama, from classic verbatim playwriting to the theater of witnesses, to dramas based on real-life events, and even to plays that incorporate fantastic elements as a way to rethink existing social issues. So the first project is a verbatim play, the Maidan Diaries, for which Vorozhbyt and her Ukrainian theater colleagues, especially Andriy Mai, collected over 30 hours of interviews with people on the Maidan. Vorozhbyt was a participant in the protests herself, but she and her colleagues decided to also use their skills as theater professionals. Although Vorozhbyt has often confessed her dislike of the verbatim technique because it's very labor-intensive and minimizes the role of the author's voice, she thought it was the only way to write about the Maidan. Quote, "Verbatim was the most honest and appropriate method for us to use to embody these events. Any other way would be dishonest. An attempt to make a feature film about Maidan right now would be an absolute failure. Documentary is the only way." End quote. Verbatim, as well as the genre of a diary, also permitted Vorozhbyt and her team to capture the participants' immediate emotional response to the events. As Vorozhbyt said in one of her interviews, quote, "It can be easy to forget things at times of such intensity. A month after some kind of an event, a person recounts it completely differently than the way they describe it while it's actually happening. People reflect on how it all came to be, they interpret the event, and justify what happened. What we collected were fresh and unaltered reactions." End quote. The Maidan Diaries are composed of accounts of events as well as conversations that took place on the Maidan. Protesters who are given direct voice in this play speak Russian, Ukrainian, or Surzhyk. Some of these accounts and conversations are highly dramatic, some are amusing and funny, but all of them testify to what it was like to be there. In one part of the play, for example, an unnamed theater professor describes his propensity to cry every time he sings the Ukrainian anthem on the Maidan. He discusses this phenomenon with great surprise, considering it almost a pathology. As someone who trains future theater directors and is therefore familiar with how to make an emotional impact on the audience, he must think himself incapable of being moved to tears by forces in his environment. Yet he cannot control his emotions in this situation and even consults a neurologist at work. The latter, who is not supportive of the Euromaidan, gives him a prescription for an expensive drug, thereby implying that such a response is indeed pathological. Yet when the professor recounts his reactions to others on the Maidan, they report having the same emotional response. And here I have a quote, which I'll read, but you can also follow along. Professor from a theater institute. "No, I understand that I begin to talk about it and I choke up. That is, it's as if I understand that in general, we are squeezing the slave out of ourselves. That is it. It's a normal process, but it makes your eyes sting. Man, I cry too when I'm on the Maidan in the middle of some events." Professor from a theater institute. "Well, you just find yourself in this energy field, an incredible energy field." Young woman. "As soon as I approach it, as soon as I enter it, I see these people and I get teary-eyed." Man. "Same with me." Professor from a theater institute. "Do you want my prescription?" And then everyone laughs. This passage demonstrates some of the principles of the verbatim technique. All the pauses, false starts, colloquialisms, and even stylistic errors, and this is my translation, and I confess that it's not very polished, and some of these stylistic errors are the hardest thing to render, actually. So all of these things are preserved in the speech of the interviewees. This technique, of course, creates an effect of immediacy and authenticity. Yet in this particular play, it also underscores the raw, unfinished character of the protesters' thoughts about the events they're experiencing. So note, for instance, how the professor struggles to explain the reason for his and other protesters' tears. He makes several attempts to begin to articulate such an explanation, and in the end reaches for someone else's formulation, Anton Chekhov's well-known metaphor, "По капле выдавливать из себя раба," we are squeezing the slave out of ourselves. The verbatim technique seems particularly fitting for capturing the unprecedented collective experience of the Euromaidan as it was unfolding. At the same time, this technique appears to be well suited for combating the Russian propaganda machine that worked around the clock to undermine the credibility of the protesters and discredit the Ukrainian revolution, chiefly by means of fake news, which may be likened to the conventional theater's manipulation of effect on the audience. In fact, a colleague of Vorozhbyt, German director Georg Genou, considers the value of verbatim theater in Russia to lie precisely in its rejection of theatrical performance in its traditional form. Quote, "Such anti-manipulation was interesting to us because the entire society in Russia was being built on manipulation." End quote. Within months, and in some cases within weeks of their completion, the Maidan Diaries were staged in Ukraine, Great Britain, Poland, and even Russia. As early as March 10th, 2014, that is just 2.5 weeks after the conclusion of the protests, the play was performed at the Golden Mask Festival at Moscow's Teatr Dok. It was received by the Russian audience with caution, although many spectators were moved by what they saw. So maybe it's possible to say that in some small measure the play succeeded in presenting an alternative image of the Euromaidan to the one spread in Russia by most Russian media. By contrast, in Kyiv, the play fulfilled a very different function. According to Vorozhbyt, it gave Ukrainians a chance to pause and to begin to process what they had lived through, because in reality there was no pause. As you know, the Euromaidan was immediately followed by Russia's annexation of the Crimea and the war in the Donbass. The second theater project that I will discuss was undertaken by Vorozhbyt and her colleague Georg Zhenu in response to the war in the Donbass and the displacement of more than 1 million, and now even more, Eastern Ukrainians as a result of the conflict. The project began almost by accident. Vorozhbyt invited Zhenu, who had come to Ukraine initially to write about the Maidan, to travel with her and a volunteer organization to the Donbass. And there, moved by the plight of civilians whose homes were being demolished by heavy artillery fire, Vorozhbyt and Zhenu offered a group of local school children to do a theater performance together about their town and their happy memories of life in this town. Working on the performance gave these young people something else to think about besides the war. And after the project concluded, Vorozhbyt and Zhenu promised to come back and do other performances with this group. Some of the group's members ended up in Kyiv, just as hundreds of thousands of other Donbass residents displaced by war. Their collaborations with Vorozhbyt and Zhenu eventually gave rise to the Theater of Displaced People. And this is their logo, and as you can see, theater is crossed out because really, this is not theater, is their claim, right? So this is a unique theater of witnesses where survivors of the war in the East tell their own stories. One recurrent production of this theater is titled Where is the East? Где Восток? It's in Russian. But only its title and the general theme of lost home remain the same from one performance to the next. Participants who volunteer to perform change all the time, and so do the stories told. Vorozhbyt and Zhenu, who work as the theater's dramatist and director respectively, meet with the participants, they listen to what they had experienced, they help them select the most important aspects of their stories or stories for the performance. Then they combine different monologues into one performance, one whole for each performance. Ukrainian theater critic Hanna Vasilovska has characterized these performances as, quote, peculiar collective therapy sessions where people can express their individual problems and feel psychological catharsis through the support of the audience, end quote. According to Zhenu, at the very least, participants in the Theater of Displaced People help survivors, participation in the Theater of Displaced People helps survivors realize that they're not alone in their pain. At most, what it can do is transform a participant from a victim of terrible circumstances into a hero of his or her own life story. At the same time, these performances foster dialogue between Ukrainians who have different views on the situation in their country. This is because the stories that these people who are displaced and now residing in Kyiv tell, these are stories that often conflict with the perspectives of Kyiv residents. Hearing their traumatic stories in the intimate setting of this theater's small-scale and rather informal performances, and then interacting with the performers, which is typical of this theater form, promotes empathy and mutual understanding. Established in 2015, the Theater of Displaced People was called by some the greatest achievement of Ukrainian theater in that year. Since then, it has gone on tour in Ukraine and abroad and has expanded its repertoire to include several other productions about the war and various contemporary social issues. So I will now play a trailer from a recent production by this theater, and hopefully technology will cooperate. And I apologize, this trailer does not have English subtitles, but it's in Russian and it's very short, and just to give you a taste of what this theater is like.
В блиндаже рядом с нашим медпунктом, где часто дежурили ребята, с ними жила собака. все любили. Там 4 или 5 смен менялось. Все ее время от времени подкармливали, она часто с ними что-то там игралась. Когда начали крыть по полной программе, когда, ну, не знаю, может за сутки набиралось часа полтора времени, когда не прилетало ничего, собака начала бояться. И однажды она испугалась, запрыгнула в блиндаж и с перепугу не пускала туда ребят, которые не менее испуганные пытались запрыгнуть. Один из солдат слишком испугался и не сообразил, что он делает, перезарядил автомат и выстрелил в них. На улице было минус 20, наверное, минус 15, как-то так, очень холодно. Но другие ребята заставили его ее хранить. Как ни странно, когда я рассказываю эту историю людям в Киеве, практически никто ее не дослушивает до конца. Все просят меня, чтобы я прекратил. Но практически никого не смущает история о людях, которые погибли, или о людях, которые остались калеками. Да. Собственно, в этом я и хочу разобраться.
Okay. Okay. So the clip that you have just watched is from a monodrama called Tovar, Product for Sale. It's directed and performed in Russian by a former volunteer medic who spent 4 years serving in the Donbass. As you can see, this theater is emphatically non-theatrical, except for the the change from video to the theater. But the performance itself, which does not include the projections. So this is a non-professional actor recounting real events he lived through in a manner that is as close to authentic speech as possible. The emphasis is on sharing the experience with the hope of making sense of it together, and perhaps through this process finding a common ground. Similarly to the Maidan Diaries, the young man featured in this performance has not processed and understood everything that he had experienced. He offers no ready-made answers or solutions, instead simply bears witness to the events in the presence of an audience. And I don't know if you could hear, but what he says is, at the end, is that I'm trying to make sense of it myself. I don't know why people feel more sorry for the dog than for all of those thousands of people who perished in the East. Okay. The last two projects by Vorozhbyt that I will describe are plays about women's experiences during the war in Ukraine's East. They're not pieces of documentary theater, strictly speaking, although each, to a greater or lesser extent, is based on real-life events. The more recent play of the two, titled Bedroads, was commissioned by the British Royal Court Theatre and premiered there in November 2017. Before I talk about this play, I'd like to show you another very brief clip made for the Royal Court Theatre. And this clip shows the author of the play, Natalia Vorozhbyt, who explains why it is that she keeps writing about the war. Is it because Western theaters only want to hear about war in Ukraine? Is this the only topic that really interests them? Well, as you will see, that's not the case. Note that in this clip, she speaks Ukrainian, kind of in keeping with her decision to identify more as a Ukrainian playwright now and put that forth as her public image. And this clip does have English subtitles, fortunately.
Ну, 3 роки тому почалася війна в Україні, і це настільки було неймовірно. Людина, яка живе в Європі, там, чи будь-якій країні цивілізованій в 21 столітті, вона не може собі уявити, що може одного дня початися в твоїй країні війна. Коли почалася війна, все якось перевернулася свідомість у людей. Ми почали замислюватись про такі речі, про які раніше ніколи не замислювалися. І, наприклад, як воно бути на війні, як воно вбивати людину. Мені набридло дивитися новини по телебаченню, слухати різні маячню про різні стереотипи, про Донбас там, і таке інше, про Захід і Схід, про про людей, які мене оточують. І я почала їздити з волонтерської організації, потім з театром переселенця, який ми зробили з Георгом Жено, і спілкуватися з людьми на Сході, там, де тільки прийшли бойові дії. І я багато з військовими спілкувалася. І це все не залишило мене байдужою. Тому я стала писати про це.
All right. So, as becomes clear from this clip, Vorozhbit keeps writing about the war because for the past several years, the war has been her experience. She has come face to face with it and its effects on people, maybe more than many other Ukrainians, because she has extensively traveled throughout the Donbass, either with the theater of displaced people or while doing research for a screenplay about the defense of the Donetsk airport. And this is for a very well-known film, Kyborgi, the Cyborgs, that has just been, recently has been released. It is thus not surprising that she has already written 2 plays about women and war, not unlike her interviewees in the Maidan Diaries or the witnesses in the performances by the theater of displaced people. Vorozhbit might be telling these stories to make sense of her own woman's experience with war. The first of the 6 stories told in Bad Roads is about an unexpected love affair between a female writer named Natasha and a Ukrainian military officer who helps her in her research of the hostilities at the Donetsk airport. And this is a situation quite familiar to Vorozhbit herself. She was literally in the shoes of this woman. And here I will also read a quote from the play that is very significant for understanding this play. I fell for you, but not at first sight. It was the second time. I was interviewing you in a cafe in Kyiv. It was a warm winter. I had dressed up. I was wearing my red coat. You were in uniform. I said, "You look good." A muscle twitched on your face, and I realized that you were pleased. You are this hero. You were talking about the war, about the Donetsk airport, which is what I was researching. You started drawing on a napkin the old and new airport terminals, the position of the enemy, list the names of weapons. I pretend I'm following, but I'm not really. You're remote, inaccessible, but my interest in the war excites you. This is my only road to you. You're drawing the only road back from the airport. So this early passage hints at the main conflict examined by Vorozhbit in this play. Men's desire for war, which excites their senses and lures them with promises of heroic status, is juxtaposed with women's desire for the men themselves, for love and intimacy even in the middle of war. These desires can hardly be reconciled, as the last 2 sentences in this passage poignantly show. From the start, these are bad roads that do not bring men and women to a place of genuine understanding or mutual satisfaction. As Vorozhbit shows in several scenes in this play, some harrowing and some laced with humor, sex in times of war often equals violence or impotence rather than love. As Vorozhbit's English translator Sasha Dugdale notes, quote, "By stressing the sexual and the female in her study of war, Natalia haunts us with with the power of conflict to warp modern society," end quote. And then she adds, quote, "What is unique about this play is that it is written by a woman from the point of view of the sexual object, and it unflinchingly describes the situation of women at war. It charts a careful line around notions of victimhood and complicity. Hardly anyone writes from this point of view," end quote. And actually, she goes on to compare her a little bit to Svetlana Alexievich. So that's for you, Anna, in the audience who's writing about Alexievich. Bad Roads will premiere in Ukraine in one of Kyiv theaters this month. The initial performance was at the Royal Court Theatre. And it will be very interesting to see how this play is received. There is some indication that the response may not be as positive as it was in Britain. Just a few months ago, Vorozhbit pitched the same project about women at war to the Ukrainian state film agency Держкіно, seeking funding to make Bad Roads into a feature film. The project was rejected, partly on account of what was described as, quote unquote, lack of patriotism. So apparently, Vorozhbit's complex and nuanced portrayal of the realities of war was perceived by some as a threat to the very notion of a military hero fighting to defend Ukraine's territorial integrity. But this is not the first time that Vorozhbit has scrutinized the construction of heroic military masculinity. Her 2015 play, Take the Rubbish Out, Sasha, Sasha Vynesi Musar, took up the same topic, yet examined it in a more lighthearted manner. So this is the last project that I will discuss, and I'll give you a little bit more detail to give you an idea how of Vorozhbit's subtle and kind of multifaceted portrayal of complex social issues. So like Bad Roads, this play gives voice to both men and women, but privileges women's perspectives, bringing to light the gender dimensions of the war in the East, and especially the impact of Ukraine's unavoidable militarization on women's lives. Unlike Bad Roads, Take the Rubbish Out, Sasha is built on a fantastic premise that enables the dramatist to show a different side of male war heroism. The play features widowed middle-aged Katya, her grown daughter Oksana, and the title character, Katya's late husband Sasha, formerly a colonel of the Ukrainian army. The extraordinary twist is that Sasha reappears in his home after his death to converse with his wife and stepdaughter. In the play's first scene, Katya and Oksana are preparing Sasha's funeral meal and mourning his death. Katya is bitter about her late husband and what she thinks was a life wasted on drink, family feuds, and a meaningless, low-paying military job. She blames Sasha for abandoning her by dying prematurely of a heart attack and begs him to come back and finish living properly, but he doesn't want to. In the second scene, which takes place a year later, Katya and Oksana reminisce about Sasha at his gravesite. With gentle humor, Vorozhbit shows how much repair work our memories of the departed can undergo in the span of a year. So instead of dwelling on his failures, she now fondly reminds Oksana of Sasha's past brave deeds. His death now looks dignified to the women because he was not bedridden and did not rely on the care of others. The play ironizes this transformation of Sasha's image by concluding scene 2 with stage directions for video projections of what the play calls frescoes. They depict Sasha in a variety of heroic situations mentioned by women, and they are reminiscent of Orthodox biographical icons that portray a series of scenes from a saint's life. According to the stage directions, the audience watches these frescoes through the eyes of an episodic male character. As the character views the last scene of Sasha's dying of a heart attack and Sasha's holding onto his chest, the man wants to believe that Sasha died of a bullet. The final scene of the play has a precise date, September 2014, which was a time of heavy fighting in the Donbass. Amidst rumors of an impending all-out war with Russia, Katya and Oksana are getting their homes stocked with food and a new wood-burning stove in case they need to live through the winter with no electricity or gas. They discuss what to do if there is a bombardment, and here Sasha suddenly reappears and begs women to let him come back. And they begin to question his motives. He responds that he wants to return and fight in the East. Katya finds it offensive that he had refused to come back when she begged him, but wants to do so in response to a military draft. And this is the 6th draft at this point, so the humor is that even the dead will rise and go and fight. As in Bad Roads, Vorozhbit depicts contrasting desires, attitudes, and perspectives of men and women in the context of war. Katya and Oksana explain to Sasha that they do not want to lose and mourn him again. As he continues to argue with them, his real motivation for wanting to return becomes clear. And this is my last quote for today. Sasha: "Girls, I took the oath. I made the promise to the people." Katya: "Well, then go to the recruitment office. What do you need the girls for?" Sasha: "There is no meaning in it without the girls. I want to be sent off." Katya: "We had sent you off already. You have no heart." Sasha: "In the 6th draft, they require the consent of surviving relatives." Katya: "I do not give my consent." Sasha: "But why? I will write you letters, send you text messages from the front. You'll send me drawings from the grandkids, packages. You'll worry about me, and I'll defend you." Sasha sees his potential participation in the war primarily as an opportunity to acquire for himself the heroic status that he had never enjoyed in his life. But he makes it clear that this goal would be unattainable without women's willing assumption of the supporting roles. As feminist scholars Sjoberg and Via explain, the institution of the military, especially in times of war, depends on most men and women conforming to traditional and mutually complementary scenarios of gender behavior. These are militarized masculinity for men and supportive femininity for women. Both scenarios require sacrifices, but because soldiers are called upon to be ready to risk their very lives, theirs is considered to be the greater sacrifice. But in the play, Sasha is already dead. So by removing this chief circumstance that is a precondition of soldiers' heroic status, life risked for others, Voroshbit is able to shift the focus to the price Katya and Oksana would have to pay for Sasha's chance at glory. Besides the potential emotional and financial cost of burying Sasha again, women point out that it would be beyond their means to purchase for him all the equipment necessary to send him to the front. And here Voroshbit is referencing the well-known role of civilian volunteers, many of them women, who were procuring essential supplies for the Ukrainian troops since the beginning of the conflict in the Donbass, because the Ukrainian government could not afford to provide them. Outfitting Sasha for the front would be Katya and Oksana's business, and it would demand resources that are already lacking in the women's daily struggle for survival. Despite women's arguments, Sasha is relentless and even tries to blackmail Katya by threatening to seek permission to return from a different woman, a former colleague whom Katya presumes to have been Sasha's lover. He taunts Katya, saying, quote, "Then she will be the widow of a hero, and you will be a nobody," end quote. In the relationship between Katya and Sasha, Voroshbit captures the character of the late Soviet gender order and its lasting impact in the post-Soviet period. As researchers of this topic have argued, the Soviet gender policies in Russia as well as Ukraine led to men's alienation from the private sphere. Normative Soviet masculinity presupposed an almost total orientation to the public sphere. According to gender scholars Yelena Zdravomyslova and Anna Temkina, quote, "A real man was first and foremost someone who participated in the Great Patriotic War," end quote. Additionally, even though the Soviet state promised to emancipate women from what was often called in Soviet propaganda domestic slavery, its policies did not include efforts to encourage greater involvement of men in the home. As a result, quote, "Household duties continued to be distributed in a traditional way, with most tasks carried out by women. Men's participation in the household was occasional and related to traditional men's duties such as changing electric light bulbs or taking out the rubbish bin," end quote. And this is where the title comes in. So the play illustrates this typically Soviet scenario of gender relationships. The private sphere is completely women's domain. Sasha does not want to come back to it. His domestic role is reduced to the act of taking out the trash when prompted by women, as in the play's title. At the same time, Sasha longs to fulfill the Soviet ideal of masculinity, in which a man's primary calling was to defend his homeland, and his reward was the status of a hero. Sasha's great desire to be a military hero is tied to the fact that he hails from the Soviet generation that could never measure up to the normative model of Soviet masculinity. He represents the generation of Voroshbit's parents, her deceased military stepfather, whose real-life story gave inspiration for this play. So the stepfather entered his adulthood in the late Soviet period, and at that time no one threatened the motherland. Yet, quote, "The values underlying the model of hegemonic Soviet masculinity were never placed in doubt," end quote. And in Sasha's case, as in the case of his real-life prototype, matters were made worse by the fact that he had a military profession, which was neither needed nor appreciated by the late Soviet and early post-Soviet societies. So men's inability to meet their society's confining standard of masculinity in the public sphere and their marginal position in the private sphere contributed to this late Soviet discourse of a crisis of masculinity, which carried over into the post-Soviet era. And a part of this discourse faulted women's expanded roles in Soviet society for having undermined male power. And some Ukrainian reviews of this play, as produced by Lithuanian and Ukrainian theaters, have interpreted this play as a contribution to this discourse. So one commentator, for example, says that the play identifies one reason for strife in contemporary Ukrainian society, quote, "The reduced significance of not just the military, but generally men as the stronger sex," end quote. Yet this kind of reading ignores the irony with which Vorozhbit portrays male characters, imaginings of male heroism, as well as her sympathetic depiction of the women's plight. By contrast, the Russian production that was done in Moscow at the Meir Holt Center emphasized Vorozhbit's critique of militarized masculinity and also emphasized the play's overall anti-war message. However, Vorozhbit has pointed out that Rezhakova changed the meaning of her work by omitting from the play all the specific references to the conflict in the Donbass and to Ukraine more generally, and made it into a universalist pacifist piece. As a result, the production obscured both the historic sources of this hegemonic construction of masculinity, the Soviet regime, and the role of Russia in making militarism a necessity in Ukraine today. And I'm almost done. Vorozhbit's original text, however, permits no such historical forgetting. When Sasha fails to convince women to let him come back from the dead, he asks them to grant his last wish and play the song which he and Katya had enjoyed in their youth. The song prompts memories of the couple's numerous happy vacations in the Crimea. In contrast to the images of this joyful past, in a location that is now off limits to Ukrainians because of Russia's intervention, pregnant Oksana in the play's present is leaving to take out the bucket full of trash, having assumed Sasha's only symbolic function in the household. As women are left to fend for themselves, the play ends with a final series of images in which Sasha and his deceased army colleagues perform military drills in the world beyond this one. And Vorozhbit tells us in the stage directions they do this, quote, just in case the girls change their minds, end quote. In this new militarized reality for Ukraine, women's lives go from hard to harder as the energies of even their late male partners are consumed with fighting the absurd, unnecessary, yet very real war. And so to conclude, let me just say that I think these examples from Vorozhbit demonstrate both the variety and the flexibility of this new drama movement, as well as what remains constant in the approaches in this form of theater. And what I think remains constant is this new drama's rejection of theater as pure entertainment, its deep interest with real-life social issues, its commitment to explore these issues in what may be termed a bottom-up approach. So these issues are shown in all of their complexity. No one is whitewashed. It's not black and white. It's very gray. No one has made full sense of what is going on. There are no preconceived ideological agendas. And all the conclusions are left up to the spectator. And of course, there are some, you can claim the Vorozhbit is making one argument or another, but you will have to, all of these arguments can be made in some sense, unless you change the text completely, as was done by the Moscow production. So it is exactly this approach to drama, the new drama approach, that sometimes makes it possible to interpret these works in different ways. And new drama has become a phenomenon in Ukraine, as I tried to show after the Euromaidan. Having returned to Ukraine, Vorozhbit, an important practitioner of this theater, found it impossible not to respond to what was happening around her. And the methods, the tools that she had, happened to be very suitable for exploring these issues. Now that she has a number of enthusiastic collaborators in Kyiv, including Maxim Kurochkin, who has come back, I predict that the new drama will really blossom in Ukraine. And just last year, Vorozhbit, Zhenu, and Kurochkin founded the Institute of Drama in Kyiv, which will no doubt increase the number of practitioners of this kind of theater and result in many experimental projects in the future. Thank you for your attention and your patience.